I don't remember much about that dinner, but I remember the chill in my bones the next morning when I woke up alone, wearing a strange hospital gown in a room I didn't recognize. My husband was gone, and I was trapped inside a nursing home I never agreed to live in. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Margaret. For 73 years, I've called this world home, and for the last 51 of those years, I shared my life with Harold in a small 2-bedroom apartment in Queens, New York. The morning light would filter through our faded lace curtains, the same ones I bought at the street market on Roosevelt Avenue 30 years ago, when we still dreamed together. The jasmine tea I'd steep in our chipped porcelain teapot would fill the kitchen with warmth, while Harold's too-strong coffee competed with its aroma. I remember the weight of that routine, how it anchored me even as everything else began to crumble. Every morning at 6:15, I'd shuffle to the kitchen in my worn terry cloth slippers, the ones with the hole near the left toe that I kept meaning to replace. The floorboards would creak their familiar song beneath my feet. I'd set the kettle on the gas burner, that same blue flame Harold taught me to light when we were newlyweds, when his hands were steady and kind. But lately, those mornings felt different, heavier, like walking through water that grew deeper with each step. I felt invisible in my own home, a shadow moving through rooms that no longer welcomed me. The exhaustion wasn't just in my bones anymore. It lived in my chest, pressing down like a weight I couldn't name. That evening in September, I remember it was a Thursday because I'd just finished ironing Harold's work shirts. He surprised me. "Margaret," he said, his voice softer than it had been in months. "Let's go to Lucia's tonight. Our table by the window." Lucia's. Our place. Where he'd proposed 49 years ago, where we'd celebrated every anniversary until the last few years when celebrations stopped mattering to him. I felt a flutter of hope. Maybe this was it. Maybe we were finding our way back to each other. I put on my navy dress, the one with the small pearl buttons he once said made my eyes sparkle. I even wore the lipstick he bought me for Christmas 3 years ago, still barely used because he stopped noticing when I made an effort. The restaurant smelled of garlic and fresh basil, just like always. Our server, Tony, still recognized us. "Mrs. Margaret? Been too long." He led us to that corner table where the evening light painted everything golden. Harold seemed different, attentive. He asked about my day, remembered that Mrs. Chen from 4B had been sick, even smiled when I mentioned finding a $20 bill in my winter coat pocket. Then he excused himself to use the restroom. When he returned, he was carrying our wine glasses. "Here, sweetheart," he said, setting mine down with a gentle clink. I didn't think much of it then. Why would I? This was my husband, the man who'd held my hand through 3 miscarriages before we had our son David, the man who'd worked double shifts at the moving company to pay for my mother's funeral. But something felt off. The wine tasted different, bitter. I mentioned it, and Harold just shrugged. "Maybe they changed suppliers," he said, not meeting my eyes. I should have trusted that instinct. I should have pushed the glass away. Instead, I kept sipping, hoping to recapture whatever magic had brought us to this table. The last thing I remember clearly is Harold's face across from me, but it wasn't the face of the man who'd loved me. There was something cold in his eyes, something calculated. When I tried to speak, my words slurred together like melted wax. The room tilted, and then darkness swallowed everything. I woke up in a place that smelled like ammonia and old flowers. The walls were beige, not the warm beige of sunset, but the institutional beige of giving up. My mouth felt like cotton, and my head pounded with each heartbeat. The hospital gown I wore wasn't mine. The bed wasn't mine. The view from the window, a parking lot instead of the street where children played, wasn't mine. A nurse with tired eyes checked my chart. "Good morning, Mrs. Stevens. How are we feeling today?" "We." As if my confusion belonged to everyone in the room. "Where am I?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "You're at Sunrise Manor, dear. Your family arranged for your care here. Don't you remember?" I didn't remember. I remembered the wine. I remembered Harold's cold stare, but I didn't remember agreeing to live in a place where strangers called me by my last name and spoke about my life as if I weren't there to live it myself. "Where's my husband?" I asked. The nurse's smile was practiced. Empty. "He'll visit soon, I'm sure. Right now, you need to rest and get accustomed to your new home." Home. This sterile room with its narrow bed and nightstand holding someone else's flowers wasn't home. Home was the morning light through lace curtains. Home was the creak of familiar floorboards and the aroma of jasmine tea. Home was the choice to be there. For 68 years, I had been making choices. At 5, I chose to help my mother with the washing instead of playing with dolls. At 18, I chose to work at the telephone company instead of going to college because my family needed the money. At 22, I chose Harold, believing in the tenderness I saw in his brown eyes. At 24, I chose to quit my job when David was born because Harold said a child needed his mother at home. Choice by choice, year by year, I built a life. I sacrificed my dreams for his dreams, my comfort for his success, my voice for his peace. And now, at 73, I was waking up in a place I never chose, wearing clothes I never picked, living a life that didn't feel like mine. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how I became the woman who could be erased so easily. Let me tell you about the 51 years of small surrenders that led to that bitter wine and that cold morning in Sunrise Manor. Harold wasn't always the man who drugged my dinner. When we met at a church social in Corona, he was 24 with calloused hands and big dreams. He worked construction then, came home dirty but proud. He'd wash up at the kitchen sink while I cooked dinner, and he'd tell me about the buildings he was helping create, how every beam and brick mattered. "We're going to have our own place someday, Maggie," he'd say, using the nickname that made me feel special. "A little house with a garden where you can grow those tomatoes you love." He called me beautiful then. He noticed when I wore the blue dress he liked, remembered to buy me daisies from the corner market on Fridays. We married in the spring of 1972 at St. Sebastian's, the same church where my parents had their wedding 25 years earlier. I wore my mother's dress, taken in at the waist because I was smaller than she'd been. Harold cried when I walked down the aisle, real tears that he didn't try to hide. Father Murphy pronounced us husband and wife, and when Harold kissed me, I tasted forever on his lips. The early years weren't easy, but they were ours. We rented that little apartment in Queens, 2 bedrooms that we filled with hope and hand-me-down furniture. I kept working at the telephone company until David came along. Harold's construction work was steady, and we saved every penny we could, dreaming of that house with the garden. But dreams have a way of shifting when you're not looking. Harold's back started hurting from years of heavy lifting. The construction work became irregular, money got tight, and somehow, without either of us really noticing, I became responsible for holding everything together. When David was 3 and Harold was laid off for 6 months, I took on sewing work, mending clothes for the neighbors, and making alterations for Mrs. Rossetti's shop on Northern Boulevard. My fingers would be raw from the needle by bedtime, but I never complained. Harold was trying. He'd wake up early, check the Union Hall for work, come home frustrated when there was nothing. I'd make his favorite dinner, meatloaf with mashed potatoes, and tell him tomorrow would be better. I believed that then. I believed that love and hard work could solve anything. I believed that marriages were partnerships where both people carried the load, even if that load shifted from time to time. I believed that the man who cried at our wedding would never hurt me on purpose. The first time Harold raised his voice at me, David was 5. Harold had been drinking. Just beer, nothing hard, but enough to make his words sharp. I'd asked him to help fold the laundry while I cleaned the kitchen. "I work all day, Margaret. Can't you handle the house stuff?" His tone cut through me like glass. I folded the laundry alone, telling myself he was just tired, just stressed from job hunting. The second time, he threw his dinner plate into the sink, shattering it against the porcelain. I was 8 months pregnant with what would have been our daughter, Sarah. The doctor had put me on bed rest, so dinner had been simple: canned soup and grilled cheese. "This isn't food, Margaret, this is garbage." I cleaned up the broken pieces while he went to the bar down the street. I miscarried that night. Harold never connected the 2 events, and I never told him they were connected in my heart. After David started school, I went back to work. Part-time at first, answering phones for Dr. Kellerman's dental practice. Harold said we needed the money, that David would need things as he got older, clothes, school supplies, maybe even college someday. I was good at the job. The patients liked me, and Dr. Kellerman trusted me with the appointment book and insurance claims. For a few years, I felt useful again, important. I had my own small paycheck, my own reason to get dressed each morning. I started to save a little money in a separate account, not hiding it from Harold, just keeping something for emergencies. Or maybe, if I'm honest, keeping something for myself. But Harold's back got worse. He started missing more work, and the construction industry was changing. Younger men with stronger backs were willing to work for less money. At 45, Harold felt obsolete. And obsolete men, I learned, sometimes take their pain out on the people closest to them. It started with criticism. The house wasn't clean enough. Dinner wasn't ready when he wanted it. I wasn't trying hard enough to make money. Why couldn't I get full-time work? Why couldn't I be more like other wives who supported their husbands? The Harold who had once called me beautiful now called me lazy, useless, a burden. I told myself it was the pain talking. His back, his pride, his fear of getting older in a world that didn't want him anymore. I made excuses for his anger the same way I'd made excuses for his drinking. Marriage was work, I reminded myself. The good times would come back if I could just be better, try harder, love him enough to heal whatever was breaking inside him. But love, I was learning, can't heal someone who doesn't want to be healed. David graduated from high school and got a scholarship to study business at UCLA. I was so proud I cried at his graduation. My boy, heading to California to build a life bigger than anything Queens could offer him. Harold was proud too, I think, but in a way that felt more like ownership than joy. I always knew that kid would make something of himself, he'd tell the neighbors, as if David's success was his doing and his alone. After David left, the apartment felt too quiet. Harold and I rattled around those 2 bedrooms like coins in an empty jar. Without our son as a buffer, every conversation became a potential argument. Harold's criticism grew sharper. My paycheck from Dr. Kellerman's office wasn't enough. I needed to find something better, something full-time. At 55, I started working as a home health aide for elderly clients around Queens and Manhattan. The irony wasn't lost on me, taking care of other people's elderly parents while my own mother lived alone in the Bronx, too proud to ask for help, and too stubborn to accept it when I offered. I'd work 8-hour shifts helping Mrs. Goldstein with her medications and making sure Mr. Patterson ate his meals, then come home to make dinner for Harold and listen to him complain about his day of watching television and nursing his bad back. My clients liked me. I was gentle with their medication schedules, patient with their stories about the old days. Mrs. Goldstein would show me photos of her grandchildren and tell me about her late husband's jewelry store on the Lower East Side. Mr. Patterson taught me to play chess and shared his memories of serving in Korea. These people trusted me with their most vulnerable moments, and for 8 hours a day, I felt valuable. But the work was physically demanding. By the time I got home, my feet ached, my back hurt, and my patience was worn thin. Harold would be waiting in his recliner, unemployed now because of his disability claim, expecting dinner and sympathy for his various ailments. The man who had once built buildings with his bare hands now couldn't manage to heat a can of soup for lunch. David called once a week, usually on Sundays. He'd gotten married to a nice girl named Jennifer, who worked in marketing. They lived in a beautiful house in San Diego with a swimming pool and a garden where she grew the kind of tomatoes Harold had once promised me. David was doing well. So well that his weekly calls began to include requests for money. "Just until I get the business off the ground, Mom," he'd say. "The startup costs are more than we expected." Or, "Jennifer's parents are helping too, but we need a little more for the down payment." Or, "You know I'm good for it. I just need to get through this rough patch." I wired him money from my savings. $500 here, $1,000 there. When my separate account ran low, I started dipping into our joint savings, telling Harold the money was for household expenses. David always promised to pay me back, and I always believed him. He was my son. He was building a life. And maybe, if I helped him enough, he'd have room in that life for his parents when we got old. Harold knew about some of the money I sent to David, but not all of it. He'd complain that we were enabling the boy, that David needed to learn to stand on his own 2 feet. But when David would call to thank us, Harold would puff up with pride. "That's my son," he'd say. "Smart kid, just like his old man." The years blurred together. I worked, saved money, sent it to California. Harold collected disability and spent his days watching television, drinking beer, and finding new ways to make me feel small. His back pain was real. I saw him struggle to get out of bed some mornings. But somewhere along the way, the pain had become an excuse for everything. An excuse for not working, not helping with housework, not being the partner I'd married. When David and Jennifer divorced after 6 years, I wired him $3,000 to help with the lawyer fees. When he started dating again and needed money to furnish a new apartment, I sent another $2,000. When he decided to change careers and go back to school for his MBA, I liquidated my retirement account to help cover his tuition. I was 63 then, still working as a home health aide, my body wearing down from years of lifting and bending and caring for people who weren't my family. Harold didn't know about the retirement account. I told myself I was protecting his feelings, that he'd worry about our financial security, but really, I was protecting my right to help my son. David was the only part of my life that felt successful. He was handsome and smart and ambitious. Everything Harold and I had hoped our child would be. If supporting him meant working a few more years, so be it. But David's thank yous were getting shorter, his calls less frequent. When I asked about visiting California, he'd make vague promises about sometime soon and when things settled down. When I suggested he and his new girlfriend visit New York, he'd mention how busy he was at work, how expensive plane tickets had gotten. I started to wonder if my money was more welcome than my presence. My mother died when I was 65. Lung cancer. Quick and cruel. I took time off work to care for her in those final weeks, sleeping on her old couch in the Bronx and making sure she had her medications on time. Harold visited once, stayed for 20 minutes, and complained the whole drive back to Queens about how depressing it was to watch someone die. After the funeral, I found myself sitting alone in my mother's empty apartment, surrounded by 80 years of accumulated life. Photos of me as a child, report cards she'd saved, the wedding dress I'd worn that was actually hers. She'd never thrown anything away that mattered to her, and I realized I mattered to her more than I'd understood while she was alive. In her jewelry box, wrapped in tissue paper, I found $5,000 in cash and a note in her careful handwriting. For Margaret's dreams, whatever they may be. She'd been saving this money for me, $20 bills tucked away from her Social Security checks, preparing for the day she wouldn't be there to help me anymore. I never told Harold about that money. For the first time in our marriage, I kept a secret that felt like power instead of shame. I opened a new savings account, just in my name, and deposited the bills that still smelled like my mother's perfume. This was mine. This was for Margaret's dreams, whatever they might be at 65. But what were my dreams? I'd spent so many years focused on everyone else's needs that I'd forgotten what I wanted for myself. I tried to remember the girl who'd worked at the telephone company, who'd saved money for a little house with a garden. What had she wanted besides a husband and children and a life of quiet contentment? Harold's arthritis was getting worse, adding to his catalog of complaints. My home health aide work was wearing me down, literally. After a particularly bad fall helping Mr. Patterson out of bed, I tore something in my shoulder that never quite healed right. Dr. Kellerman had long since retired, and his replacement didn't need a part-time receptionist who was pushing 70. I found myself unemployed for the first time since David was little, dependent on Harold's disability checks and the money I'd hidden away. That's when the real Harold emerged. Without my income to supplement his disability, money got tight. And when money got tight, Harold got mean, not just critical now, but cruel. I was stupid for getting hurt on the job. I was worthless for not finding new work fast enough. I was a burden he shouldn't have to carry into his old age. The worst part wasn't the words. I'd developed thick skin for those over the years. The worst part was the way he looked at me, like I was a problem he was trying to solve, like I was an obstacle between him and the life he thought he deserved. David called less frequently now. Once a month, if I was lucky. His MBA had led to a good job with a tech company in Seattle, where he'd moved with his new girlfriend, Rachel. They were talking about marriage, about buying a house, about starting their own family. When I asked if he could help with some expenses while I looked for new work, he sighed like I was asking for the moon. "Money's tight for everyone, Mom," he'd say. "You and Dad have been married 50 years. Surely you've saved something." He didn't know I'd spent my savings on him. He seemed to have forgotten about the thousands of dollars I'd sent over the years, the retirement account I'd emptied to help fund his dreams. In his mind, those had been gifts freely given, not loans to be repaid. Harold started talking about downsizing. The apartment was too big for just the two of us, he said. The rent was too high. Maybe we should look into senior living, someplace with services included. At first, I thought he meant we'd face this together. Two old people helping each other navigate the challenges of aging. I was wrong. One afternoon, while I was at the grocery store, Harold went through my personal papers. When I came home with bags of food I'd bought with careful attention to our shrinking budget, he was sitting at the kitchen table with my bank statements spread in front of him. The account with my mother's money. The account that was mine alone. "What's this?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. I felt like a child caught stealing candy. "That's my mother's money. She left it for me." Harold's face went red. "Your mother's money? We're married, Margaret. What's yours is mine, isn't it? All these years I've been looking at our bills, wondering how we're going to make ends meet, and you've been hoarding cash like some kind of miser." He was right about community property, technically, but he was wrong about everything else. This wasn't hoarding. This was the first thing I'd ever kept for myself. The first financial decision I'd made without considering his needs first. This was my mother's love transformed into possibility, and I wasn't ready to give it up. But I did give it up, eventually. Not all at once, but slowly. $20 here and $50 there. Harold would mention an overdue bill, a prescription he couldn't afford, a repair the apartment needed, and I'd go to my secret account and withdraw just enough to cover the emergency. Each time, I told myself this was the last time. Each time, I promised myself I'd protect what was left. Within 2 years, my mother's gift was gone, dissolved into the household expenses and Harold's various needs and the cost of keeping peace in a marriage that no longer brought me joy. I never did figure out what my dreams were supposed to be. By the time I had the chance to explore them, I no longer had the means. That's when Harold started looking at nursing homes. Not for both of us. For me. He was researching facilities, collecting brochures, making phone calls when he thought I wasn't listening. When I confronted him about it, he had a reasonable explanation ready. "You're getting forgetful, Margaret. Last week, you left the stove on when we went to the store. What if there's a fire? What if you hurt yourself when I'm not here to help? He was right about the stove. I had left it on just once because I was distracted by a phone call from a creditor. But I wasn't forgetful. I was overwhelmed, stretched thin by the constant worry about money and Harold's health and my own aging body. I don't want to live in a nursing home, I told him. I want to stay here, in our home. Harold's laugh was bitter. This isn't our home, Margaret. This is a rental apartment with thin walls and broken plumbing. This is barely better than the projects. Don't you want something nicer for your old age? Someplace with nurses to help you, activities to keep you busy, people your own age to talk to? What he didn't say, but what I heard clearly, was that he wanted me somewhere else. Somewhere he didn't have to look at me every day, reminded of the failures and disappointments that had shaped our marriage. Somewhere he could visit when convenient and leave when he'd had enough of playing the dutiful husband. I started paying closer attention to Harold's conversations, the ones he had when he thought I was napping or busy in the kitchen. Phone calls about care facilities and admission requirements and insurance coverage. Papers he kept in a folder marked Margaret's Care Plan, as if my future was a project to be managed rather than a life to be lived. That's when the dinner invitation happened. That September evening when Harold suggested Lucia's, when he seemed like the man I'd married instead of the man I'd grown old with, when he drugged my wine and left me to wake up alone in a place I never agreed to call home. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. Let me tell you about what I found before that dinner. Let me tell you about the discovery that changed everything. A week before Harold suggested dinner at Lucia's, I was looking for my birth certificate. David had asked me to send a copy for some paperwork related to Rachel's immigration status. She was from Canada, and apparently they needed family documents for their marriage license. I kept important papers in an old metal box in our bedroom closet, behind Harold's winter coats. The box was heavier than I remembered. When I opened it, I found my birth certificate quickly enough, but underneath it were documents I'd never seen before. Applications for nursing home admission, filled out in Harold's handwriting. Financial affidavits claiming I was incapacitated and unable to manage money. A power of attorney document that gave Harold full control of my assets and medical decisions, signed with what looked like my signature but felt wrong in my hands. At the bottom of the box, in an envelope marked Margaret's medical history, I found the most damaging thing of all. A letter from a doctor I'd never met, stating that I showed signs of early dementia and required full-time care. The letter was dated 3 months earlier. I'd never been examined by this doctor. I'd never shown signs of dementia. But on paper, I was officially too incompetent to make decisions about my own life. Harold had been planning this for months, maybe longer. While I'd been worrying about our finances and his health, he'd been methodically building a legal case to have me committed. The power of attorney meant he could access my bank accounts, sell my possessions, make medical decisions on my behalf. The dementia diagnosis meant no one would believe me if I protested. I sat in that closet for an hour, surrounded by Harold's winter coats, reading and rereading documents that erased my personhood with medical terminology and legal jargon. This wasn't about my safety or my health. This was about getting rid of a wife who had become inconvenient, expensive, and harder to control. The cruelest part was how reasonable it all looked on paper. An aging woman with no income, showing signs of confusion, married to a disabled man who could no longer care for her properly. Of course she needed professional help. Of course her devoted husband was doing the responsible thing by ensuring she got the care she deserved. The system was designed to protect people like me from neglect and abuse, but Harold had turned it into a weapon to achieve both. I put the documents back exactly as I'd found them. Harold couldn't know that I knew. Not yet. I needed time to think, to plan, to figure out how to fight back against a system that had already decided my fate. That's when I started paying attention to the small details I'd been missing. The way Harold's eyes followed me around the apartment, calculating and cold. The conversations he'd have with David that stopped abruptly when I entered the room. The pills he'd started keeping in the kitchen, claiming they were vitamins but watching carefully to make sure I didn't examine them too closely. The night before our dinner at Lucia's, Harold was unusually attentive. He asked if I wanted tea, offered to rub my shoulders, even suggested we watch one of the old movies I liked on television. It felt like a goodbye, though I didn't understand that until later. He was saying goodbye to the wife he was about to erase, being kind to her one last time before she disappeared forever into the beige walls of Sunrise Manor. I should have run. I should have grabbed my purse and walked out of that apartment and never looked back. But where was I supposed to go? I had no money. Harold controlled our accounts. I had no job. Who hires a 73-year-old woman with a torn shoulder and a mysteriously disabled heart? I had no family. David lived across the country and seemed to think I was already living in Fantasyland, calling David. I had no friends. I'd been too busy taking care of everyone else to maintain relationships of my own, so I stayed. I put on my navy dress and went to dinner with my husband, and I let him drug my wine because the alternative was admitting that I was completely alone in the world, with no one to protect me from the man who'd promised 51 years ago to love and cherish me until death do us part. But death didn't part us. Harold's betrayal did. When I woke up in Sunrise Manor, groggy and confused and wearing someone else's hospital gown, a part of me was almost relieved. The waiting was over. The worst thing I could imagine had happened, and I was still breathing. I was still thinking. I was still Margaret, even if everyone around me was treating me like a problem to be managed instead of a person to be respected. The first few days were the hardest. The medication they gave me made everything fuzzy around the edges. My thoughts moved slowly, like they were traveling through thick honey. The nurses spoke to me in the bright, false voices people use with children and the very old. "Time for your medicine, Margaret. Let's get you to the activity room, Margaret. Your husband called to check on you, Margaret. Isn't that nice?" Harold visited once during that first week. He brought flowers, daisies from the same corner market where he used to buy them when we were young. He sat in the uncomfortable visitor's chair and talked about how worried he'd been, how this was the best place for me, how I'd appreciate the 24-hour medical care once I settled in. "I don't want to be here," I told him. My words were still slurred from whatever they were giving me, but my meaning was clear. Harold patted my hand like I was a confused child. "I know it's an adjustment, sweetheart, but you'll make friends here. There are activities, game nights and movie screenings. You always loved movies." I wanted to scream at him. I wanted to grab his collar and shake him until the lies fell out of his mouth like broken teeth. Instead, I squeezed his hand as hard as I could manage and whispered, "I know what you did, Harold. I found the papers." For just a moment, his mask slipped. I saw fear in his eyes, and guilt, and something that might have been shame. Then the mask snapped back into place. "You're confused, Margaret. The doctor said this might happen. The medication can affect your memory in the beginning." He left after 30 minutes, promising to visit again soon. He never came back. Over the next few weeks, as the medication fog began to clear, I learned about the life Harold had arranged for me. Sunrise Manor was a decent facility. Not the worst I could have imagined, but far from the best. My room was small but clean, shared with a woman named Dorothy, who spent most of her time staring at a television that was always tuned to game shows. The food was institutional but edible. The staff was overworked but generally kind. I had no access to my own money. Harold controlled my finances through the power of attorney, and according to his reports to the staff, I was depleting our savings rapidly with my care. The cost of Sunrise Manor was $2,000 a month, money that was supposedly coming from the sale of our possessions and the liquidation of our joint accounts. But I knew our finances. We didn't have enough savings to cover long-term care, even with Harold's disability checks. Either he was lying about the cost, keeping me in a less expensive facility while pocketing the difference, or he'd found another source of income. Given what I knew about Harold's capacity for deception, either possibility seemed likely. I tried to call David. The number I had for him was disconnected. When I asked the staff to help me contact my son, they said family communications had to go through Harold as my designated care coordinator. Harold, who never returned the messages I left with the front desk. Harold, who had effectively cut off all contact between me and the outside world. That's when I met Emma, not my granddaughter. I didn't have one yet, despite all of David's promises about starting a family someday. This Emma was 7 years old, visiting her great-grandmother who lived 2 doors down from my room. While the adults talked, Emma would wander the halls, curious and unafraid, in the way only children can be. She stopped by my room one afternoon when Dorothy was napping, and I was sitting by the window, watching the parking lot and feeling sorry for myself. "Why are you sad?" she asked, climbing into the empty chair beside my bed. Her directness was refreshing after weeks of adults who talked around their meanings and avoided difficult truths. "I'm not supposed to be here," I told her. "This isn't my home." Emma nodded seriously. "My mommy says sometimes grown-ups make mistakes about where kids are supposed to live too. That's why we have social workers and judges and people who make sure kids are safe, out of the mouths of babes." A 7-year-old understood something I hadn't considered. There were people whose job it was to protect vulnerable adults from abuse and neglect. I'd been so focused on my helplessness that I hadn't thought about seeking help from the system itself. Emma visited me 3 more times over the next few weeks while her great-grandmother was dying. Each visit, she'd bring me something small, a drawing she'd made, a cookie from the cafeteria, a flower from the courtyard outside. She never asked for anything in return except stories about what life was like when I was young. Through her eyes, I started to remember that my life had value beyond what I could provide for other people. The day after Emma's great-grandmother passed away, I asked to speak with the facility's social worker. Her name was Janet, and she had the tired but determined look of someone who'd seen too much but hadn't given up yet. I told her about the forged documents, the fraudulent medical diagnosis, the power of attorney I'd never signed. I told her about Harold's systematic plan to have me committed against my will. Janet listened carefully, taking notes and asking questions that showed she understood the legal implications of what I was describing. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Mrs. Stevens, what you're describing is elder abuse. Financial and emotional abuse that could constitute criminal behavior if we can prove it. Are you prepared to file a formal complaint against your husband? For 51 years, I'd protected Harold from the consequences of his choices. I'd made excuses for his drinking, his unemployment, his cruelty. I'd enabled his weaknesses and absorbed his anger because I believed that's what wives were supposed to do. The idea of deliberately causing him trouble felt like betraying everything I'd been taught about marriage and loyalty. But sitting in that small room in Sunrise Manor, wearing clothes that weren't mine and living under restrictions I'd never agreed to, I realized that Harold had betrayed me first. He'd broken every vow we'd made to each other, violated every trust I'd placed in him, and stolen the future I thought we'd share together. My loyalty to him had been one-sided for years. Maybe it was time to be loyal to myself instead. "Yes," I told Janet. "I want to file a complaint. I want to go home." The process was slower than I'd hoped, but faster than I'd feared. Janet helped me contact legal aid attorneys who specialized in elder abuse cases. They investigated Harold's forged documents, consulted with medical experts about the fraudulent dementia diagnosis, and built a case for my immediate release from Sunrise Manor. The hardest part was proving that I was mentally competent to make my own decisions. Harold's fake medical records had created a paper trail suggesting cognitive decline, and overturning a medical diagnosis required extensive testing and evaluation. I spent hours with neurologists and psychiatrists, taking memory tests and answering questions designed to assess my mental acuity. It was humiliating to have to prove my own sanity, but it was also empowering. Every test I passed was evidence that Harold had lied. Every correct answer was proof that I was still the person I'd always been, despite his attempts to erase me from my own life. 3 months after I'd woken up in Sunrise Manor, I walked out the front door as a free woman. Janet drove me back to the apartment in Queens, where Harold was waiting with a mixture of defiance and desperation that I'd never seen before. He'd been served with legal papers. His fraudulent power of attorney had been revoked, and he was facing potential criminal charges for elder abuse. The apartment looked different, smaller, shabbier. Or maybe I was seeing it clearly for the first time in years, without the filter of obligation and familiarity that had made me accept less than I deserved. Harold's recliner dominated the living room like a throne. Surrounded by empty beer bottles and magazines he'd scattered across the coffee table. The kitchen was dirty, dishes piled in the sink and garbage overflowing onto the floor. In the 3 months I'd been gone, he'd lived like a bachelor, with no regard for the home we'd shared for decades. "So you're back," Harold said, not bothering to get up from his chair. "I hope you're happy now. Do you know what you've put me through? The lawyers, the questions, the embarrassment. People think I'm some kind of monster because of your lies. My lies." After everything he'd done, the forged documents, the fake medical diagnosis, the secret institutionalization, he was making himself the victim. It was so typical of Harold that I almost laughed. Instead, I went to our bedroom and started packing. "What are you doing?" Harold asked, appearing in the doorway. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked genuinely worried. "You can't leave, Margaret. Where would you go? You don't have any money. You don't have anywhere else to live." He was right about the money. The legal battle had cost more than I'd expected, even with legal aid assistance. My share of our joint savings was minimal. Harold had been telling the truth about that much. But Janet had connected me with resources I hadn't known existed. Senior housing programs, social security benefits I'd never applied for, job training programs for older adults who wanted to re-enter the workforce. "I'm going to live my own life," I told Harold, folding my navy dress into a suitcase I hadn't used since our honeymoon. "I'm going to make my own choices. I'm going to be happy." Harold followed me through the apartment as I gathered my possessions, alternating between anger and pleading. How could I abandon him after 51 years of marriage? How could I destroy our family over a misunderstanding? How could I be so selfish when he'd done everything for love? I stopped packing and looked at him, really looked at him, for what I knew would be the last time. This man who'd once made me feel beautiful and cherished and full of possibility. This man who'd held my hand through miscarriages and celebrated David's achievements and danced with me in our tiny kitchen on our anniversary. This man who'd systematically destroyed my self-worth, stolen my autonomy, and tried to erase me from my own life. Harold, I said softly. You didn't do any of this for love. You did it because you were afraid. Afraid of getting old, afraid of being alone, afraid of taking care of someone else for a change instead of always being taken care of. And instead of facing those fears, you decided to make me disappear. That's not love. That's cowardice. I finished packing in silence while Harold retreated to his recliner and his television and his beer. When I was ready to leave, he didn't get up to say goodbye. He just sat there, looking smaller and more pathetic than I'd ever seen him, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Pity. Not enough to stay, but enough to remember the good man he'd been before fear and weakness turned him cruel. My new home was a studio apartment in a senior housing complex in Astoria, about 20 minutes from the old neighborhood. It was smaller than what I was used to, but it was mine. I signed the lease, paid the deposit with money from a part-time job Janet had helped me find, and hung my pictures on walls that belonged to no one but me. The job was perfect for someone with my background, working as a patient advocate at a community health center, helping elderly clients navigate the medical system and understand their rights. I was good at it because I'd lived through what many of them were experiencing. I understood what it felt like to be dismissed, ignored, or treated as incompetent simply because of my age. I could translate medical jargon, challenge unfair treatment, and remind people that growing old didn't mean giving up their dignity. For the first time in decades, I had colleagues who valued my opinions and clients who appreciated my help. I had a paycheck with my name on it and a bank account that belonged only to me. I had evenings when I could read a book or watch whatever I wanted on television without asking permission or enduring criticism. I also had something I'd almost forgotten existed: silence that felt peaceful instead of tense. David called 6 months after I'd left Harold. He'd finally gotten my new phone number from directory assistants, and he was angry. Not concerned about my well-being or curious about why I'd left his father, but angry that I'd disrupted the family without consulting him first. "What's gotten into you, Mom?" he demanded. "Dad says you've lost your mind, running around with lawyers and making crazy accusations. He says you're living in some kind of singles complex, dating other men. This isn't like you." I let him talk until he ran out of accusations and assumptions. Then I said, "David, your father drugged my wine at a restaurant and had me committed to a nursing home without my consent. He forged legal documents and filed false medical reports to steal control of my assets and my medical decisions. I spent 3 months locked up in a facility I never agreed to enter, and when I finally got out, he showed no remorse and no concern for what he'd put me through. Would you like to explain to me which part of that I should have accepted quietly?" There was a long silence. Then David said, "Dad wouldn't do something like that. You must have misunderstood something. Maybe you were confused, or maybe the medications affected your memory." My own son was gaslighting me, just like Harold had, making me question my own experience, my own memory, my own sanity. It shouldn't have surprised me. David had learned about relationships by watching his parents, and Harold had been his primary male role model. But it broke my heart in ways I wasn't prepared for. "David," I said, "I have legal documents proving everything I just told you. I have medical records showing that the dementia diagnosis was fraudulent. I have testimony from social workers and attorneys and doctors who helped me get out of that situation. But if you'd rather believe that I'm lying or confused than face the possibility that your father is capable of abuse, that's your choice. Just don't expect me to participate in my own gaslighting anymore." He hung up on me. 3 months later, I got a wedding invitation in the mail. David was marrying Rachel in a ceremony in Seattle. Harold was listed as his best man. I wasn't mentioned anywhere on the invitation, not even as mother of the groom. Apparently, I'd been erased from that family narrative too. I cried over that invitation for about 10 minutes. Then I threw it away and went to work, where Mrs. Chen was waiting to thank me for helping her get the hip replacement surgery her doctor had been denying her because of her age. Mrs. Chen brought me homemade dumplings and told me I was an angel sent from heaven. That felt better than any wedding invitation. The divorce papers arrived a year after I'd moved out. Harold was claiming irreconcilable differences and seeking half of everything I'd accumulated since leaving him, including my new savings account, my pension from the health center, and the small inheritance I'd received when my aunt died. He was also asking for alimony, claiming that his disability made him unable to support himself, and that I owed him financial support based on our 51 years of marriage. I hired a lawyer with money I'd saved from my job. Harold's strategy was predictable: portray me as a mentally unstable woman who'd abandoned her disabled husband in his time of need, then claim financial hardship to justify taking whatever assets I'd managed to accumulate independently. My lawyer's strategy was simpler: present the evidence of Harold's elder abuse, and let a judge decide whether someone who'd tried to steal his wife's autonomy deserved her money too. The hearing was surreal. Harold appeared in court wearing his best suit, looking frail and confused and victimized. He testified about his disabilities, his financial struggles, and his bewilderment at my sudden departure from our marriage. He presented himself as a devoted husband whose wife had inexplicably turned against him, taking legal advice from strangers who didn't understand the dynamics of a long marriage. When it was my turn to testify, I presented the forged power of attorney documents, the fraudulent medical records, and the testimony of the social workers and attorneys who'd helped secure my release from Sunrise Manor. I described waking up in a nursing home I'd never agreed to enter, wearing clothes that weren't mine, living under restrictions I'd never consented to. I explained how Harold had systematically isolated me from outside contact and stolen my right to make decisions about my own life. The judge was a woman about my age who listened carefully to both sides before rendering her decision. She granted the divorce, ruled that Harold's elder abuse disqualified him from receiving alimony, and ordered him to pay my legal fees as restitution for the financial costs of fighting his fraudulent legal actions. Walking out of that courthouse was like stepping into sunlight after years in a cave. I was officially free from Harold, with legal documentation of my independence and court recognition that I was capable of managing my own affairs. The marriage that had defined my adult life was over, and I discovered that ending felt more like relief than grief. But the real transformation didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened gradually, over months and years, as I learned to trust my own instincts again. It happened every time I made a decision: what to eat, what to watch, where to go, without considering anyone else's preferences first. It happened every time I spent money on something I wanted, instead of something someone else needed. It happened every time I said no to a request that would drain my energy without offering anything meaningful in return. The hardest part wasn't learning to live alone. I'd felt alone for years while married to Harold. The hardest part was learning to like my own company, to value my own opinions, to believe that my happiness mattered as much as anyone else's. I started small. I bought flowers for my apartment just because I liked how they looked on my kitchen table. I signed up for a watercolor painting class at the community center, something I'd always wanted to try but never had time for when I was busy taking care of everyone else's needs. I started eating dinner at restaurants by myself, bringing a book and enjoying the luxury of a meal I hadn't cooked or cleaned up after. Then I started bigger. I applied for a passport, something I'd never had because Harold said international travel was too expensive and too complicated. I researched destinations I'd dreamed about when I was young: Ireland, where my grandmother had been born; Italy, where the art and architecture looked like something from a fairy tale; Scotland, where the landscapes seemed to shimmer with ancient magic. I chose Ireland first, partly because of the family connection, but mostly because the photos of green fields and stone cottages made something in my chest feel light and hopeful. I booked a 10-day tour through a company that specialized in travel for older adults, women traveling alone. The trip was everything I'd hoped and more than I'd dared to expect. I stayed in bed and breakfasts that were older than my entire country, walked along cliffs that fell away into an ocean that stretched to the horizon, and listened to traditional music in pubs that had been serving travelers for centuries. I met other women my age who were also discovering independence later in life: widows, divorcees, women who'd spent decades caring for others and were finally learning to care for themselves. One evening in a pub in Galway, I was sitting alone with a glass of wine, listening to an old woman sing traditional Irish songs in a voice that made the entire room fall silent. The song was about loss and longing, but also about endurance and hope. When she finished, the room erupted in applause, and she caught my eye across the crowded space and smiled. After her set, she came to my table and asked if she could sit down. Her name was Bridget, and she was 84 years old. She'd been singing in that pub for 30 years, ever since her husband died and left her with nothing but a house full of memories and a voice that could break hearts. "You look like someone with a story to tell," she said, her accent thick as cream and twice as warm. I found myself telling her everything: Harold, the nursing home, the divorce, the trip to Ireland as my first act as a truly free woman. Bridget listened without judgment, nodding at the painful parts and smiling at the moments of triumph. When I finished, she raised her glass in a toast. "To the women who discover their own strength when the world thinks they have none left," she said. "To the courage it takes to start over when everyone believes you're too old to begin. To you, Margaret, for choosing yourself when no one else would." I cried then, right there in that crowded pub in Galway. But they were good tears, clean tears, tears that washed away the last residue of shame and regret I'd been carrying. I was 75 years old, sitting in a foreign country with a stranger who understood me better than my own family ever had, and I felt more alive than I had in decades. When I came back to New York, everything looked different. The same apartment, the same job, the same routine, but seen through eyes that had witnessed my own capability for adventure and change. I decorated my walls with photos from Ireland, started cooking Irish recipes I'd learned from the bed and breakfast owners, and began planning my next trip. David called on my 76th birthday. It was the first time I'd heard from him since the divorce hearing 2 years earlier. He was awkward on the phone, clearly uncomfortable but making an effort that surprised me. "Mom," he said, "I want you to know that Rachel and I are having a baby. You're going to be a grandmother." He paused, and I could hear him struggling with words he'd probably rehearsed. "I've been thinking about what you said, about Dad, and what happened before the divorce. I talked to some people, did some research, and I think maybe I didn't understand the situation as well as I thought I did." It wasn't an apology, but it was acknowledgement. After 2 years of silence, my son was admitting that I might have been telling the truth about his father's abuse. It wasn't enough to rebuild our relationship immediately, but it was enough to crack open the door to possibility. "I'd like to meet my grandchild," I told him. "When you're ready for visitors, let me know." He promised he would, and for the first time in years, I believed him. The baby was born 6 months later, a girl they named Emma, after Rachel's grandmother. David sent photos, and I sent gifts, and slowly we began the careful process of rebuilding trust. When Emma was 6 months old, David and Rachel came to New York for a visit. Meeting my granddaughter was like looking at the future and the past simultaneously. She had David's dark hair and curious eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. But when I held her, she settled into my arms like she'd been waiting her whole short life to meet me. I felt that flutter of fierce love that I remembered from when David was born, mixed with hope for the kind of relationship I'd never had with his father. David and I talked carefully around the edges of our estrangement during that visit. He didn't apologize for choosing Harold's version of events over mine, and I didn't apologize for refusing to pretend that abuse was acceptable. But we found common ground in our love for Emma and our desire to give her something better than the family dysfunction we'd both lived through. Harold wasn't mentioned during the visit, though I knew he was still alive and still living in the old apartment in Queens. David and I had an unspoken agreement not to discuss him, at least not yet. Some wounds need time to heal before they can be examined closely. When David and Rachel left, I felt lighter somehow. Not because we'd resolved everything between us, but because I'd proven to myself that I could love my son and my granddaughter without compromising my own boundaries. I could be a grandmother without going back to being the woman who absorbed everyone else's problems and neglected her own needs. That Christmas, David invited me to Seattle. Not for the holidays themselves. That would have been too much too soon. But for a visit afterward, when Emma would be old enough to travel and the holiday stress would be over. I accepted, and we began planning a relationship that acknowledged our past without being imprisoned by it. On the plane to Seattle, I thought about all the trips I hadn't taken when I was married to Harold, all the invitations I'd declined, the adventures I'd postponed, the dreams I'd deferred because someone else's needs always seemed more urgent than my own desires. I was 77 years old, flying across the country to visit a son who'd once told me I was crazy, carrying gifts for a granddaughter I was just learning to know. It wasn't the family I'd expected to have, but it was the family I'd chosen to build. David and Rachel's house was everything Harold and I had dreamed of when we were young. A garden where vegetables actually grew, rooms filled with natural light, neighbors who waved instead of avoiding eye contact. Emma was walking by then, stumbling around the house with the determined concentration of someone learning to navigate the world on her own terms. Watching her reminded me of my own recent lessons in independence. During that visit, David and I finally talked about Harold directly. Not about the nursing home or the divorce. Those wounds were still too tender. But about Emma's relationship with her grandfather. Harold wanted to visit, David said. Wanted to meet his granddaughter and rebuild relationships with the family. "That's your decision," I told David. "She's your daughter, and he's your father. But I need you to understand that Harold isn't just my ex-husband. He's someone who tried to steal my autonomy and lock me away when I became inconvenient. I can't pretend that didn't happen, and I can't put Emma at risk by pretending he's safe to be around children." David was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I want Emma to know her grandfather, but I also want her to understand that families can be complicated, that love doesn't excuse harm, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from people who hurt you. I want her to learn from your example, Mom. I want her to be strong like you are." It was the closest thing to an apology I was likely to get from David, and it was enough. We were never going to have the simple, uncomplicated relationship I'd once hoped for, but we were building something real and honest instead. Emma would grow up knowing that her grandmother was a woman who'd survived abuse and chosen independence, who'd rebuilt her life from nothing when she was already old. Maybe that would be a better legacy than pretending our family had been perfect. I stayed in Seattle for 2 weeks, long enough to establish routines with Emma, to feel comfortable in David and Rachel's home, to believe that this new relationship was genuine rather than temporary. When it was time to leave, Emma cried and reached for me, and I felt that bittersweet pull between love and independence that I was still learning to navigate. Back in New York, I threw myself into work and travel, and the small daily pleasures of living alone. I took painting classes and joined a book club and volunteered at the community center, where I'd first learned about my legal rights. I mentored other women who were facing elder abuse, sharing my story and the resources that had helped me escape Harold's control. The work was deeply satisfying in ways my previous jobs had never been. I wasn't just earning money or keeping busy. I was using my experience to help people who were trapped in the same kinds of situations I'd survived. Every woman I helped get free from an abusive spouse, every elder I connected with legal aid services, every person I empowered to make their own medical decisions felt like vindication for the pain I'd endured. One afternoon, a woman about my age came to the community center for help. Her name was Rose, and her situation was almost identical to mine. A husband who was systematically removing her access to money, medical care, and social contacts in preparation for having her declared incompetent. She'd found a power of attorney document among his papers that she'd never signed, and she was terrified of ending up in a nursing home against her will. I spent 3 hours with Rose that first day, explaining her legal rights and connecting her with the same attorneys who'd helped me. But more than the practical assistance, I gave her something I desperately needed when I was in her situation. Someone who believed her story. Someone who understood the subtle ways abuse could be disguised as care. Someone who'd survived what she was experiencing and come out stronger on the other side. "How did you find the courage to leave?" Rose asked me as we were finishing our session. "How did you know you could survive on your own after so many years of being told you were helpless?" I thought about her question for a long time before answering. "I didn't know I could survive," I finally said. "But I knew I was already dying inside the marriage. The abuse was killing me slowly, one criticism and one stolen choice at a time. Leaving felt terrifying, but staying felt impossible. Sometimes the only choice is between two kinds of fear, and you have to pick the fear that leads toward life instead of the fear that leads toward disappearing." Rose nodded, tears in her eyes, and I saw myself from 4 years earlier. Confused, scared, but beginning to understand that she deserved better than the life she was living. 6 months later, she called to tell me she'd filed for divorce and moved into her own apartment. A year after that, she started volunteering at the community center herself, helping other women find the courage to choose themselves over abusive relationships. This became my life's work in ways I'd never expected. Not the official job. I was still working as a patient advocate at the health center, but the informal mentoring and support I provided to women who were discovering their own strength in their 70s and 80s. We called ourselves the Late Bloomers, and we met once a month to share stories, celebrate victories, and remind each other that it's never too late to start over. The Late Bloomers came from all backgrounds. Some were widows learning to live alone after decades of marriage. Others were divorced women rebuilding their identities. Still others were women who'd never married, but were facing age discrimination and family pressure to give up their independence. What we had in common was the experience of being underestimated because of our age and the determination to prove that growing old didn't mean giving up our power to choose. Through the Late Bloomers, I met women who'd started businesses in their 70s, earned college degrees in their 80s, traveled to countries they'd only dreamed of visiting when they were younger. I met women who'd left abusive relationships after 50 years of marriage, women who'd stood up to adult children who were trying to control their finances, women who'd fought medical professionals who dismissed their symptoms because of their age. Each story reminded me that my experience with Harold wasn't unique, but neither was my capacity for survival and growth. I wasn't special because I'd escaped from his abuse. I was human, and humans are remarkably resilient when they finally decide they deserve better. On my 80th birthday, the Late Bloomers threw me a party at the community center. There were about 30 women there, ranging in age from 65 to 92, each with her own story of late life liberation. They gave me a photo album filled with pictures from all the trips I'd taken in the past 5 years: Ireland, Scotland, Italy, Greece, Morocco, Peru. Countries I'd only read about when I was married to Harold were now places where I had memories and friends and experiences that belonged only to me. But the best gift wasn't the photo album. It was a letter from Emma, who was now 4 years old and learning to write. David had helped her with the spelling, but the message was all hers. "Dear Grandma Margaret, thank you for showing me that girls can be brave and strong. I love you very much. Love, Emma." That letter sits on my refrigerator now, next to photos from my travels and a watercolor painting I made of the Irish countryside. It reminds me every morning that the choices I made, to leave Harold, to divorce him, to rebuild my life from scratch in my 70s, weren't just about me. They were about Emma and all the other young women who need to see that it's possible to choose yourself, even when everyone around you is saying you should choose someone else instead. Harold died 2 years ago. David called to tell me, and to ask if I wanted to attend the funeral. I said no, and I didn't feel guilty about it. Harold had been dead to me for years, ever since the morning I woke up in Sunrise Manor and realized that the man I'd married had been replaced by someone who saw me as a problem to be solved, rather than a person to be loved. I didn't mourn Harold's death because I'd already mourned the death of our marriage, the death of the dreams we'd shared when we were young, the death of the man he'd been before fear and disappointment turned him cruel. The Harold who died in a Queen's hospital bed, surrounded by machines and strangers, wasn't the same person who'd cried when I walked down the aisle 51 years earlier. That Harold had died gradually, killed by his own choices and his own cowardice, and I'd grieved for him long ago. David inherited Harold's possessions and his debts, which were considerable. It turned out Harold had been borrowing money against his disability benefits for years, accumulating credit card debt and taking payday loans to maintain the illusion that he could still be the provider he'd once been. Without my income and the financial support I'd been giving him for decades, he'd spiraled into the kind of money troubles that would have dragged me down with him if I'd stayed. Learning about Harold's financial situation confirmed something I'd suspected but hadn't wanted to face. His plan to have me committed to a nursing home hadn't been motivated by concern for my well-being. It had been motivated by his need to access my Social Security benefits, my pension, and whatever savings I had left. He'd wanted to use my money to pay his debts while keeping me locked away where I couldn't interfere with his financial decisions. The realization was painful but also liberating. It meant that every doubt I'd had about leaving him, every moment of guilt about breaking up our family, every fear that I was being selfish or ungrateful had been misplaced. Harold hadn't been trying to take care of me. He'd been trying to use me. Leaving him hadn't been abandonment. It had been self-preservation. Today at 82, I'm sitting in my apartment in Astoria, looking out the window at a world that's full of possibilities I'm still discovering. Tomorrow, I'm flying to Barcelona with 3 other late bloomers for a 2-week trip through Spain. Next month, I'm starting a memoir writing class at the local college. In the spring, David and Rachel and Emma are coming to visit for a week, and I'm planning to take Emma to her first Broadway show. My life isn't what I expected it would be when I was young and dreaming of forever with Harold. It's smaller in some ways. I live alone in a studio apartment instead of sharing a life with a partner. It's bigger in other ways. I've seen more of the world in the past 7 years than I saw in the previous 75. It's different from anything I could have imagined when I was 22 and walking down the aisle toward a future I thought was guaranteed, but it's mine. Every choice, every mistake, every triumph, every ordinary Tuesday morning when I wake up and decide what to do with my day, it all belongs to me. I don't have to ask permission or justify my decisions or consider anyone else's needs before my own. I can be generous when I want to be generous and selfish when I need to be selfish. And both choices are equally valid because they're both genuinely mine. The woman who woke up that morning in Sunrise Manor, confused and drugged and wearing someone else's hospital gown, feels like a character from someone else's story now. I remember her, and I feel compassion for her, but I'm not her anymore. She was a woman who'd forgotten her own worth, who'd accepted cruelty as the price of companionship, who'd believed that loving someone meant disappearing into their needs and desires. I'm a woman who knows her own value, who chooses kindness from people who respect her boundaries, who believes that love should make you more yourself rather than less. I'm a woman who looks in the mirror and likes what she sees, not because I'm perfect, but because I'm authentic. I'm a woman who made the hardest choice of her life at 73 and discovered that it's never too late to save yourself. The scars from Harold's abuse will always be part of me. The years I spent diminishing myself, the dreams I deferred, the voice I learned to silence, they're all part of my history, and I can't pretend they didn't happen. But scars are evidence of healing, not just evidence of harm. They're proof that I survived something that was meant to destroy me, and that I came out stronger on the other side. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd found the courage to leave Harold 20 years earlier, or 30, or 40. Would I have had a different career, traveled more, developed friendships that weren't constrained by his jealousy and control? Would I have been a better mother to David if I hadn't been so depleted by the energy it took to manage Harold's moods and needs? But those questions are pointless now. I can't change the past, and I wouldn't want to erase all of it, even if I could. David exists because I married Harold. Emma exists because David exists. The woman I am today exists because of everything I survived, including the things that nearly broke me. The only question that matters is what I do with the years I have left. And I know the answer to that question. I'm going to live them fully, actively, intentionally. I'm going to travel to places that fascinate me and learn things I've always been curious about. I'm going to maintain relationships with people who appreciate me and walk away from people who don't. I'm going to help other women discover their own strength and celebrate when they find the courage to choose themselves. I'm going to be the grandmother Emma deserves. A woman who shows her that age doesn't mean invisibility, that independence doesn't mean loneliness, that it's possible to be strong and kind at the same time. I'm going to model for her the kind of relationship where both people are valued, where love enhances rather than diminishes, where no one has to give up their essential self in order to be accepted. Most of all, I'm going to remember that I matter, not because of what I can do for other people, not because of the roles I play in other people's lives, but because I'm a human being with inherent worth and dignity. I'm going to remember that my happiness matters, that my comfort matters, that my dreams matter. Even now, especially now, when the world wants to tell me that I'm too old for dreams to matter. Have you ever lived, or known someone who has lived, something like this? Have you ever felt invisible in your own life, trapped by the expectations and needs of people who claim to love you? Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to choose yourself, to walk away from relationships that diminish you, to discover who you really are when no one else's needs are drowning out your own voice? If you have, please share your story in the comments below. Your experience matters, and there are other people who need to hear that they're not alone, that survival is possible, that it's never too late to start over. And please, if this story has touched you in any way, like this video and subscribe to this channel. Your support helps me continue opening my heart and sharing these difficult but necessary truths. Together, we can create a community where no one has to face abuse alone, where everyone understands that growing older doesn't mean giving up the right to be treated with dignity and respect. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for believing that it mattered enough to be told. And thank you for being part of a world where women like me can find the courage to speak our truth, no matter how long it takes us to find our voice. The sun is setting now outside my window in Astoria, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that remind me of the Irish countryside I've grown to love. Tomorrow will bring new possibilities, new choices to make, new chances to live fully in the life I've created for myself. And that's enough. That's more than enough. That's everything I never knew I was allowed to want.